Hello everybody. I am Massimiliano Nicotra. I'm a lawyer and a researcher of DFOhub, and I will talk about the future of legal entities in a decentralized world. Why we are talking about this issue? I think that it's important to talk and to analyze if a virtual legal entity, we can call it virtual legal entity, can assume a role in the real world, like real legal entities. Okay, we must first talk about some important issues of the decentralized world. The first issue is the blockchain technology assure that the decentralized execution of code will be not altered. The code, the commands of the code are executed as specified in the code itself, with no alteration or interferences. The second big features of the virtual legal entity is that it has a self-executing governance. And this is, I think, that this is the big difference with the real world. A virtual legal entity don't need a human to execute, to enforce the provision of the statement, of the decisions of the community, the stakeholder. They have a self-executing governance. That means that what the stakeholder decide with the voting system of the virtual legal entity, it's self-executed. It's executed automatically by the virtual legal entity. This means that probably we can have a accountability gap. If we have no a due diligence on the code of the smart contract, we can face some problems. Maybe with the new DFOhub we can assure and we can make a safely self-government smart contract of the legal entity. With other types of decentralized autonomous organization, when we have no solutions to implement or to change the code, the accountability gap is a real big issues of the security of this type of entities. But we must talk about the elements of the blockchain ecosystem and the elements that make the difference between the real legal entity and the virtual legal entity, virtual blockchain legal entity. Okay, the first element of the blockchain ecosystem is the decentralization. We have hardware, platform, administration and management, application logic level, and data decentralization. The second element is autonomous. What means autonomous organizations? Autonomous organization means that we have an automated nature of intermediation between the parties. We have no agreement. We don't need anymore an agreement on each decision. We have an automated intermediation between the stakeholder, between the shareholders, because the smart contract automate all the decision and the intermediation between the parties. And what is an organization? What do we mean when we talk about an organization? But in this type of entity, we talk about the participating parties. The organization in a virtual blockchain legal entity is about the technological components and the human components of this legal entity, because technology and humans forms the organization itself, and this is, I think, it's a real challenge, because we have self-executing decision, but it depends on technology, and it depends on the technology solutions that we can rely on. So, in a real world, what is a legal person? A legal person. We are talking about legal entity, but what is a legal person? In law, a legal person is a fictio iuris. It's a legal construction. The legal person doesn't exist in the real world. They usually we made a legal person to decrease the risk for the participants of the legal entity. In law, we say that legal personality is the result of an exchange between certain legal protection and the submission to some governing rules and certification. Usually, you form a legal entity, a company, to obtain certain legal protection of your assets, but you must follow certain governing rules. You must follow some certification. Think about the accountants, the mandatory accountants for the corporation. But these governing rules, this certification can give you protection in front of the risks that the legal entity will assume for its activities. What are the elements of a legal entity? Usually we have the governance mechanism, the purpose. All the legal entity must have a purpose. The company, the corporation, the commercial company has a profit, have a profit purpose. The association or the foundation have a no profit purpose. Usually we have operational and management statement, a statement that govern the governing rules of the legal entity. And usually the legal entity has assets. But in a decentralized world, in a blockchain world, what are the governance system? We have the boards of director, or call it as you want, and in a parallel dimensions, we have the governance nodes of the consensus algorithm. So maybe we have two ownership instrument, or maybe we have two accounting analysis type. Another question is if a state recognition is required for the legal entity, for forming a legal entity. Usually the laws require a written instrument, the external manifestation of the rules of the legal entity, a statutory registration process with signature of the founders. This is important. Both in common and in civil law, you have processes to register at the Chamber of Commerce the legal entity, and only after the registration the legal entity really born in the real life. The third element is the publicity. Only when the publicity of the registration was done, the legal entity born in the real life. Okay. And what are the consequences for an unregistered organization? Usually, the consequences, if you act for an unregistered organization, you are directly liable for the acts that you do. Don't have the protection, the assets protection that the laws guarantee for the corporation, for the formal legal entity, to the formal legal entity. The legal system usually lock the legal forms of a company. They rules the life of the legal company. They rules the governance that they must and they can assume. They rules the publicity of the managers, of the important facts of the legal entity. They rules the liability of the legal entity. They rules the accounts, and they also rules the winding up of the legal entity. But we have two more key issues in the blockchain world. The new features of the DAO, of the DFOhub, the decentralized governance that the law don't has rules for this type of features, and the automation of the entity with no humans involvement in the execution of the decisions of the legal entity, of the virtual legal entity. So, what are the required elements of a legal entity in the real world? First of all, the legal entity must have a name. And if you think it's the same in a blockchain world, in a DFOhub, you have an address or a name of the DFO. Secondly, the element usually and in a lot of countries it's mandatory. You must have an address, real or digital. Real or digital address, it's important because where you choose to have the address is the determining point for the applicability of some law or of others laws. Usually the address, the business address of a legal entity determines the application of the state law of the address. So the real or digital address, it's important to understand which law we must apply to the legal entity. But if you think that a digital address, we already have a digital address. In Italy, we have the domicilio elettronico, the electronic address of a company. And if you have a digital address, you can choose the applicable law. If you think, usually in the agreement, in the international agreement, you say and you can choose which is the applicable law of this agreement. So we can make a choice. We can say that we are on a virtual legal entity, and that we want to apply the Italian law or the USA law or the Delaware law and so on. It's maybe we can think of a matter of choice and not a real link with the territory. Okay. The third element is the purpose. We say that all the legal entity must have a purpose that can be a profit purpose, a commercial purpose, or a non-profit purpose, a benefit purpose. The legal entity, usually the commercial company, has a capital, has assets. The capital, it's not the patrimony. Capital is the assets that will be used for the liability, for the agreement to pay, to solve the obligations of the legal entity. So the fifth element is the governance. How much human intervention is needed in a legal entity? For this element, we must do some distinction. First of all, we have a clear distinction between the responsibilities of the decentralized, automated, and human-specific interaction. In a virtual blockchain legal entity, we have this clear distinction between these types of governance. And the second that is that humans are not liable for situations that extend beyond their own engagement liability. Usually, humans in the real legal entity don't have a responsibility for the action of the legal entity, and so we must have the same type of protection in a virtual legal entity. In a virtual legal entity, we also can have bad software code. In a virtual legal entity, we must rule the voting, the governance, the voting technology, and the token, and the token that can assure someone to vote in this type of organization. The really first question is, it is possible to make the tech organization directly liable for losses and breach, excluding the participants' responsibility, because this is the real issue of the real legal entity. We say that in a real corporation, in a real company, in a real limited liability company, the participants doesn't have responsibility for the acts of the legal entity, for the obligations of the legal entity. And is it possible in a virtual legal entity to translate this type of limitation of responsibility of the participants? This is the real legal issue, and this is usually connected to the governance form of the legal entity. Ownership and controls. Usually, in a real world, we have the identification of the ownership, but this is not always true. If you think the corporation listed in the stock exchange, you don't know who is the shareholder. You don't know the ownership of all the shares. Usually the law requires that when you have a determined amount of shares, you must communicate your ownership, your name, your identity to the control authority. But if you don't have a relevant control of the corporation, you are not identifiable. You are not obliged to communicate anything to the authority. Patrimony is another element of a legal entity. The patrimony could be tangible and intangible. If you think if you think a virtual blockchain legal entity, usually this patrimony can be settled in the smart contract and in the funds of the virtual legal entity itself. Winding up. What is the procedures for winding up a virtual blockchain legal entity? Maybe we must do a fork, or we can have a smart contract dissolution. We must vote, like in the DFOhub smart contracts. We must vote for stopping, for dissolute the smart contract, so the legal entity will be winded up, and the legal entity cannot tax anymore. The regulation in the real world. For certain activities, financial services, public services, you must comply to some specific regulation. And the registration. We said before that most of European countries, but also in common law, the country needs to have a registration of the corporation. Only after the registration, the legal entity boards and become a real legal entity. But it's still necessary in a blockchain world, the registration. If you think the smart contracts will be transparent, it is transparent and is widely accessible to all the stakeholder of the blockchain, and maybe this makes unnecessary the registration process, because it's like a public registry, and it's already met in the blockchain. Also, we have some example of regulation for the virtual legal entity, for a legal entity on the blockchain. The question whether an entity should be considered a legal person is reducible to other questions about whether or not the entity can and should be made the subject of a set of legal rights and duties. So it's a matter of liability and it's a matter of obligations. Can the legal entity be an attribution center of obligations? This is the real questions, and these would be the answers if we want to make a real virtual blockchain legal entity. Think about the Vermont regulation. In Vermont, they made the blockchain-based limited liability companies. They rule for a real legal entity that lives on blockchain. It's a particular type of regulation, because if you see they say that the statement of the legal entity, the blockchain-based limited liability company, must specify in its article that has elected to become a BBLLC. They must specify in their statement that they want to be a blockchain-based limited liability company. And they must specify the operating agreement and the mission and purpose. We saw that the elements of a legal entity is the purpose, is the agreement, is the statement, and here in the statement you must say that you want to be a blockchain-based limited liability company. Also, they provide other elements to this type of legal entity. They must specify in the provisions, in the statement, if the blockchain is partially decentralized or fully or partially public or private, the access, how the participant can access the information, read and write permissions, how the blockchain-based limited liability company will respond to system security breaches or other unauthorized action affecting the blockchain technology integrity, and the rights and obligation of each participant group within the BBLLC. You can see that in a virtual legal entity returns the two governance system, the participant governance system, the decision governance system, and the technology governance system. They are in parallel. They are both important for the regulation of this type of entity. Okay. Another regulation was the ones of Wyoming, but they didn't say a lot. They only say that the token you can define the token like stock. In Delaware, they say they say that blockchain can be used like a regulating tool, like a register. In Montana, they say that utility tokens are anti-security, but this is only a clarification for the Security Acts and to try to not oblige the issuer of the utility token to complain to all the securities law in USA. What are the challenges for a real for regulating a virtual legal entity, and especially a virtual legal entity in a decentralized world that could use a blockchain technology? The first challenge is decentralization itself. Can we stop a decentralized legal entity? Can we winding up this type of entity? This is important because if we cannot stop the legal entity itself, it's difficult to end. It's difficult to regulate the obligation of the legal entity and the liability of the participants. The second challenge is the liability. It's possible to make a separate liability framework for the virtual legal entity and its participants. This is the main question, because if we can do this separation, we have a sort of real legal entity. We have a sort of real legal entity governance and liability framework, liability legal framework. Complexity. We in a virtual legal entity, more complexity, more smart contracts, more codes equals more bugs and more risks. So we must always consider the technological issue for the legal entity, for the virtual legal entity. And can we upgrade the code without upgrading the legal entity? If the platform, if the platform changes, what does it mean for the legal entity? If we have a biggest upgrade of the platform, and you can't vote in the smart contract for 2 weeks. What's happened? How can we govern these issues? How can we manage these issues? The transition, the security. Usually, we always think about the security of the transition, of the security of the technology. In the most of the laws that regulate technological issues, you have a particular attention for the security issues. The incentives. What are the incentives to participate in a virtual legal entity? It's different of a real legal entity or not? And after all, the chain of liability and regulation. The chain of liability and regulation means the link between the participants and the obligations of the legal entity. I think that these are the challenges that we must face up to regulate the possibility to form a virtual legal entity in a blockchain system. And we have specific problems to solve. The first decentralized autonomous organization was the DAO. And the DAO will be always remembered for the DAO hack. That was not a hack, but was an error, a code error of the smart contract. With the new types of decentralized organization like DFO, decentralized flexible organization, we can solve some of these problems, and we can solve the specific problems of the DAO hack, because we can upgrade the contract, we can upgrade the governance of the decentralized organization. And this is a big issue, because usually a legal entity doesn't, how can we say, doesn't live alone. The legal entity usually grow. They have a lot of interaction with other people or other legal entity. So we must have a system to upgrade time by time the legal entity, the virtual legal entity. And the DFO, I think that is a big step to a new type and the possibilities to have a virtual legal, a real legal virtual entity in the blockchain world. Thank you.